This 74-year-old man found out, after being married for 51 years, that his wife had cheated on him and that his sons were not actually his biological children. This is a shocking story of a 74-year-old man named Ellison Creed, who discovered that his 40 and 42-year-old children aren't his after 51 years of marriage. How he reacted to the situation has got many people talking. I will read out the story to you, and by the end of it, we will pick one or two wisdom tips that we can learn from it. Here is his account. My name is Ellison Creed. I'm 74 years old, and this is the story of how one medical test changed everything I ever believed about my family and myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, when life seemed simple and trust was never questioned. My family lived in quiet Spokane, Washington, a place where the river flows gently and the trees paint the sky with colors every fall. For decades, my family was my peace. Merla, my wife, and our two sons, Kenneth and Dale, filled our home with laughter and love. Our house sat on a quiet street with blooming gardens and warm sunsets that made every evening feel like a blessing. Life was simple, steady, and beautiful. That calm lasted until the day my brother, Curtis, fell ill and needed a kidney transplant. That's when everything I believed began to unravel. Curtis needed a kidney transplant, and I was ready to help however I could. I asked my sons, Kenneth and Dale, to join me for the testing, never imagining that the results would break my world apart. My brother Curtis was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney failure, and time was quickly slipping away from him. He'd always been the strong one growing up, while I took the quieter path and built a family with Merla. Merla and I had been married for over 50 years, through thick and thin, rain and drought. But in that moment, sitting in the clinic with my boys, something in me shifted, and not because of Curtis's illness. The doctors came back a few days later with puzzled expressions, holding charts they didn't know how to explain. They told me, gently at first, that I wasn't a biological match to either Kenneth or Dale, not even close. I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the samples got switched. Maybe they had the names wrong. But when the retest confirmed it, I sat on the bench outside that hospital, unable to move or even think. Kenneth, the older one, had my calm voice and love for woodworking, and Dale inherited my quiet stare. I raised them with everything I had, my money, my time, my lessons, and most of all, my loyalty. But as the truth settled into my bones, I realized I had raised two strangers while living next to a stranger. My wife, Merla, stood beside me in the parking lot, saying nothing, just clutching her purse tighter than usual. She didn't deny it. She just looked at me with that flat stare, like she knew it would come one day. I asked her, in a voice that wasn't even mine, if she had anything to say. She only nodded. Her nod wasn't regret. It wasn't relief. It was more like surrender, like someone caught hiding stolen things. That's when I walked back inside, not to talk to the doctor, but to find an envelope for divorce papers. It didn't matter that I was 74 or that we'd been together more than half a century. What mattered was the truth. She had two children with two different men, and she let me raise them as mine. I kept thinking about Dale's first birthday, how I stayed up all night baking that cake Merla said wouldn't matter. And Kenneth's high school graduation, how I worked overtime for months just to afford the custom suit he wore. The memories didn't feel like memories anymore. They felt like stories I borrowed from someone else's life. I went home that night and sat at the edge of our bed, wondering what was even real. Merla didn't follow me inside right away. She stayed outside in her garden, as if nothing had changed. When she finally walked in, she started making coffee like we weren't living inside a lie that had just exploded. I asked her if she knew both fathers, and she said yes, said they were old friends from different jobs. She told me it had been a phase, a lapse in judgment, but she couldn't stop it once the boys came. She said she didn't think I'd ever find out, and that she didn't want to destroy what we had. What we had? That line hit harder than the test results, because now I couldn't figure out what we meant. I looked around the house we built, the photos on the wall, the marks on the door frame where we tracked height. Those boys weren't mine by blood, but they were mine in every way that had ever mattered until that moment. I couldn't unlove them, but I also couldn't keep pretending that love had been rooted in truth. And as I looked at Merla, at the woman I once believed would never lie to me, I saw a life misplaced. I sat there, thinking about how many mornings we shared, how many anniversaries we celebrated. Every year, she gave me a card with the same phrase, "Thank you for choosing us." But she had made choices long before I had. Ones I never knew about, ones I never agreed to. And now, in my old age, I was being handed the pieces of a life I thought I'd built myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing next to me. It wasn't loud, just soft and steady, but every breath felt like a reminder of what she never told me. 42 years of fatherhood had been handed to me without a warning that it wasn't mine to carry. At sunrise, I packed a small bag and left the house before the birds even started chirping. I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam the door. I just walked out like I was done pretending. The air outside was cold, but it helped clear my thoughts, which had started spinning the second I learned the truth. I went to stay at my cousin Walden's place, a quiet trailer home out near the train yard. Walden didn't ask questions. He handed me a warm mug and told me I could stay as long as I needed. That first day, I sat in silence while the news looped in my head like a broken record. I remembered how Dale used to sit on my shoulders during parades and how Kenneth used to steal my tools. Those moments played back in my mind, but now they felt like dreams I didn't belong to anymore. I tried to write down my thoughts that evening, hoping it would help me make sense of the pain. But the words kept falling apart on the page, just like my idea of family had. What do you write when your entire story turns out to be someone else's script? I crumpled the paper, tossed it in the bin, and sat by the window watching nothing at all. The next day, Kenneth called me 3 times. I didn't answer, not because I didn't love him, but because I did. I couldn't pretend to be okay when everything inside me felt cracked and hollow. Dale texted later that night, asking if I'd be at his daughter's birthday party next week. The words stared back at me like a challenge I wasn't ready to face. How do you celebrate life when yours has just been rewritten without your permission? I thought about the times I punished them, taught them, held them when they were sick, and stayed up during storms. I wasn't a perfect father, but I was a present one, and that should have counted for something. Yet all I could think about now was how I had become a character in someone else's hidden story. I remember the day Merla told me she was pregnant with Kenneth, her eyes glowing with what I thought was joy. Back then, I didn't have a reason to doubt her, and she gave me no reason to ask questions. We were young, full of hope, and ready to build a life we thought would last forever. But hope without honesty is like building a house on sand. It stands until the ground decides otherwise. I stayed at Walden's for 2 weeks, barely speaking, barely eating, just sitting in quiet thought. On the 15th day, I drove to my church, not for prayer, but for guidance I didn't know I needed. I sat in the last pew and watched the light come through the stained glass, painting the floor in slow color. The silence inside that church was the first peace I had felt since the truth came crashing into my life. A few days later, Merla showed up at Walden's door, not with tears or apologies, but with an envelope. Inside was a letter she'd written, explaining things she couldn't say out loud, or maybe didn't want to. She said the affairs were brief, never serious, and happened during years I worked long shifts on the rail. She claimed she panicked when the pregnancies came and chose silence over truth because she feared losing everything. But she had already lost me the moment she let me give my whole heart to a lie. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer, not out of forgiveness, but out of exhaustion. There wasn't anger anymore, just something colder, like absence where love used to live. And once something leaves your heart that way, it never returns the same. I thought about going back home, just to gather my things and say goodbye to the boys. But then I realized, how do you say goodbye to people who still think you're their father? How do you explain to them that the blood never matched, even though the love always did? So I stayed quiet, knowing that love didn't come with proof, and truth didn't always come with love. The weight of all those years pressed into me, like a life I couldn't return for refund or exchange. I called Kenneth a week later, kept the conversation short, just enough to say I was okay. He asked when I'd come home, and I said soon, even though I hadn't decided what home was anymore. And as I hung up, I realized I was still the only father they had ever known. Even if the blood didn't match, the bond we shared had been real every step of the way. But now that bond felt bruised, like something heavy had pressed against it for too long. I could still remember the feeling of their small hands wrapping around my fingers years ago. It wasn't easy to accept, but love had tricked me into believing what my eyes couldn't see. And maybe that was the most painful part, how much I trusted something that never belonged to me. Merla didn't just lie about the boys. She stole my right to know the full truth. And once that right is taken, no apology or explanation can return what was lost. The house was just as I left it when I finally went back one cold Sunday morning. The porch light was still flickering, and the garden looked like no one had touched it in weeks. I stood at the door for a long time, holding my breath, not knowing what I'd feel. Then I opened it and stepped into the silence that waited for me like an old coat. Kenneth was in the kitchen, fixing a leaky faucet, acting like everything was normal again. Dale came out from the hallway holding his daughter, whose smile could have melted anyone's grief in seconds. Neither of them said a word about the tests or about what they might have heard from Merla. Maybe they didn't know, or maybe they knew and just wanted to keep pretending the past still fit. I looked at the photos still on the wall. Vacations, birthdays, holidays, all moments shaped by the lie. But I also saw something deeper than deception, the weight of love given without conditions or contracts. I had poured everything into raising those boys, and maybe the pain now was just proof of that love. Even if I never belonged to them by blood, I had belonged to them by choice. Later that evening, I found Merla sitting in her sewing chair, mending a torn pillow like nothing had changed. She didn't look up. She just kept threading the needle, her hands slow but steady with each pull. I watched her for a moment, then walked to the hallway to pick up the divorce papers I had left. But my fingers froze above the envelope. I wasn't sure what justice looked like anymore. Was justice leaving? Was it staying? Was it even possible at this age to start over without dragging the past behind? I sat on the couch with the papers in hand, staring at the signature line that had waited for weeks. And in that moment, I realized something. Closure didn't always come through decisions. It sometimes came through silence. I folded the papers back up and slid them inside the drawer, knowing I couldn't rewrite 51 years. Over the next few weeks, I tried to act normal, fixing the fence, sweeping the porch, drinking coffee with Kenneth. But there was always a pause, always a quiet crack between us that neither of us knew how to cross. I didn't ask him what he knew, and he didn't ask me why I looked older than I did before. We carried our questions like bricks in our pockets, pretending they weren't weighing us down with every step. Merla and I didn't talk much, but she made dinner, and I mowed the lawn, and life just continued. It felt strange, living beside someone I no longer trusted, but routine made betrayal easier to ignore. Each night, I'd lie in bed and wonder if I should have walked away completely, disappeared into a new town. But each morning, I stayed, for reasons I still can't explain without sounding weak or afraid of loneliness. One night, as Dale helped me fix a broken light on the porch, he paused and said something quiet. He said he knew about the test results and that it didn't matter because I was the only dad he'd ever had. He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept screwing the light in place like it was any Tuesday. But those words sank into me, softer than truth, heavier than lies, and harder to carry than I ever imagined. I didn't respond. I just stood beside him, holding the toolbox, wishing I could say something wise. But wisdom doesn't always come in words. It shows up in choices, in silence, in how we keep going anyway. And so I kept going, not because I forgave Merla, but because I couldn't undo the love I'd already given. Even if the beginning of our story was built on lies, the middle and end were still mine to shape. Sometimes I still look at the photos on the wall and wonder what my real children might have looked like. Would they have my ears, my laugh, my calm? Would they have stayed honest with me their whole lives? I'll never know. That part of my story was stolen, buried in choices Merla made when she thought I'd never find out. But life moves even when we don't, and sometimes all we can do is follow behind it with tired feet. Now I'm older, quieter, and not quite the same man I was before that hospital visit. I still attend church. I still fix the fence. I still kiss my granddaughter on the head every Saturday morning. But deep inside, I carry a quiet ache, a space where truth should have lived, but never did. And maybe that's my final lesson sometimes. Even love can grow in the soil of secrets. This story may be difficult to process, but here's what stirred even more emotion. Ellison chose to forgive his wife. Yes, despite the betrayal, he stayed, mostly for the sake of the two boys he raised as his own. His decision set social media on fire. Some bashed him, saying he was weak and should have divorced her immediately. Others praised his heart, calling him a real man for choosing love over vengeance. So, what do you think? Was Ellison right to forgive and stay? Or should he have walked away? While you decide, here are 5 raw wisdom tips to take from this story. 1. Don't blindly trust. Love is not an excuse to stop asking questions. If something doesn't feel right in your marriage or relationship, don't ignore it. Investigate, ask, dig deeper. Blind trust can leave you wide open for lifelong pain. 2. Get a DNA test early if there's doubt. If you have even a small reason to question paternity, get the test. Don't wait 30 years to find out you were raising another man's children. It's not about being paranoid, it's about protecting your future. You have the right to know. 3. Protect yourself legally and financially. Have your name on documents. Know where the money goes. Understand your rights. Betrayal hurts worse when you're left with nothing. Secure yourself legally so you don't lose your family and your future. 4. Love your kids, but be smart. Love unconditionally, yes. But don't be naive. Know that fatherhood is more than being present. It's also about truth. If the children aren't biologically yours and you weren't told, that's a betrayal, not just a misunderstanding. 5. Forgive, but never forget. Forgiveness is for you, but forgetting is foolish. Learn from the betrayal. Use it as fuel to set stronger boundaries. The same knife shouldn't cut you twice. This is your life. Don't let anyone rewrite your story with lies. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment sharing what resonated most with you. Like and subscribe to Graceful Wisdom for Elders for more true stories like this. Until next time, keep living with grace and purpose.